on Danny Gomez for this morning's Net Zero Carbon segment. Danny, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. How you guys doing?
We are great. Danny, do you believe in UFOs?
What's it called? Fermi's principle, where it's like statistically, it's kind of insane to think that we're the only people in the universe. So yes.
And maybe these UFOs run on, I don't know, solar energy.
It has to be efficient to make that trip.
For sure. They've got some good renewable resources, I'm sure.
So today we're talking about carbon offsets. Danny, what are you hearing lately?
So for those who aren't super familiar with carbon offsets, voluntary carbon credits are a mechanism that firms are using to offset their carbon emissions. So the way I think of it is a scale, a balance. And so on one side, you've got all the emissions, and on the other side, you can stack up a bunch of carbon offsets to try to neutralize what your impact is from an environmental perspective. And if we think about historically, before these mechanisms were in place, people were emitting and weren't really having to pay any social cost, or hopefully they had some programs in place. But I always think of it as air that we share, and that some companies historically have been using and polluting over time in exchange for in running their business. And so what voluntary carbon credits are doing are saying, hey, look, we now have a mechanism for corporations, for people to try to offset the damage that they're doing from an emissions perspective. Now, a lot of criticism comes into play with this because people are wanting firms to focus on the problem and not to be putting Band-Aids on what they're doing from an emissions perspective. So rather than do a voluntary carbon offset where you're offsetting the emissions you're doing, you should be investing in greening up your business. And so the reality is both things are true in most cases. I think it's a small fraction of the companies that are just kind of what some firms will refer to as greenwashing their business. It is a problem, and people are aware of it, and there's public recourse for doing those things in terms of perception, and there's incentives for people not to be greenwashing their business just from a public perception perspective. And so what is happening is that these voluntary carbon markets are now starting to mature and become ubiquitous. And we're seeing a lot of investments from big funds in standing up these marketplaces. And so what we hope to do on this show is to start to talk about how these fit into the business and how people can fold them into their net zero goals, appropriately. And so this coming Friday, we're going to be talking to Link Logistics about how they think about carbon offsets and how they've chosen to approach that problem.
Okay, that was going to be my next question, really kind of the differences between carbon offsets and greenwashing. We're looking at carbon offsets. Are there different ways of going about it, different forms of carbon offsets?
Yeah, for sure. And that's part of the problem of the market, right? There's not a bunch of fungibility, that there's a lot of nuances between the projects themselves, the localities, right? Are you going to try to fund projects that are here local, domestically? Are you trying to fund them close to the source of, your emissions internationally? What types of projects are you funding? Are you doing reforestation? Are you doing carbon capture? And then what are the co-benefits? So, one of the commonly referred to projects is, I think it's in Africa, it's a cook stove project where historically, and these are predominantly women who are having to go out, they're trying to get firewood, they're taking the firewood back into their huts, and they're burning the huts as for cook stoves. And so there's a project that comes in and does electric cook stoves, and so they're able to eliminate the need for these women to go out and in these dangerous situations and try to source firewood, and then they also have the health benefits as well. And so people get really excited about the co-benefits that are happening in this, in the societies that these projects are being deployed in. And so that means that there's not these vanilla, hey, there's just so much nuance to each project. And so you really are shopping as you're going out, and there has been a lot of brokering of offsets, so a lot of intermediation, because the market is pretty complex, and there's folks who want to help help people navigate those projects, and then you also have to think about what is commonly referred to as vintages and other environmental products. Like when was the emissions sequestered? What year did that happen? What year did that activity take place? And then also, what registry did this project get filed with? There's a handful, 4 or 5 registries that are trusted, and they each kind of have their own way to interfacing. And so what is happening is a company will say, okay, well, I love this project. I love the Cookstow project. Let me go to the developer directly, or let me go to someone who can give me access to those credits. I'm going to do my own carbon accounting and figure out how big my emissions are, decide how much of that I want to offset, and then I'm going to go purchase those offsets to cover all or some of those emissions, and I'm going to retire those offsets, so take those off the market. And so that's the process, and depending on what project you pick, it could be $10 a metric ton up to thousands of dollars a metric ton if you're going for some very advanced carbon capture technologies that are still early stages and not at scale yet.
And Danny, when we're looking at where we are from a technological standpoint with carbon offsets, how are we as a country in comparison to other parts of the world, for example, Europe?
So there's, it's where the projects I think historically have been developed. So I think as a country, we've been a part and involved in the process, and there's been a lot of groups who've been involved in a lot of startups now that are trying to provide access. And so I would say that we've been lockstep with really the world in terms of pushing this market forward. It's more on the adoption side. What Europe is ahead of us, I believe, a little bit in seeing the value of these offsets. I think culturally, I think from a government regulatory perspective, I think there's just more acceptance of voluntary carbon credits. Here in the United States, there's still, I think, a lot of questions around, what are these things? What do they really mean? Are they really just giving people a free pass to emit? And so, trying to find the true value in what these are and what are the right applications. And so I think companies like Walmart, Coca-Cola, Nike, Apple, all of these companies have been, utilizing these for quite some time. And I think they're all thinking of interesting ways on how they can interface with the market and be more involved, I think, is probably what we're going to see more going forward, rather than just showing up to buy a bunch of offsets, really being involved in the process of how do we fund projects, how do we, create voluntary carbon credits that align with our goals and values. And the best way to do that is really to be in the front seat with the people who are developing these projects.
Danny, while we've still got you, anything else we should be looking out for when it comes to the future of carbon offsetting?
I think some more what I'll call organization in the market. As more and more people get involved and there's more and more buyers, I think they're going to want to simplify the process. And you start seeing that some in the market today, where firms are stepping in the middle and saying, hey, don't care so much about the project specifically. Tell me geography and type, like reforestation. And then let's just buy on those basis and try to, narrow down the options, because right now it's just a lot for people to digest.
A lot indeed, Danny. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'm excited to see how this industry continues to grow and develop, and I'm sure we'll be checking in with you to see how that goes.
Awesome, thanks.